10 is Tuskegee syphilis study. Syphilis was a major public health problem in the 1920s, and in 1928, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, a charity organization, launched a public healthcare project for blacks in the American rural South. Unfortunately, the Great Depression rocked the US in 1929, and the project lost its funding. Changes were then made to the program. Instead of treating health problems in underserved areas, in 1932, poor black men in Alabama were instead enrolled in a program to treat what they were told was their bad blood. They were given free medical care as well as food and other amenities such as burial insurance for participating in the study. But what they didn't know was that they were being tricked. The men in the study weren't told that they were recruited for the program because they were actually suffering from syphilis, nor were they told that they were taking part in a government experiment studying untreated syphilis. It was called the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. That's right, untreated. Now, despite thinking that they were receiving medical care, subjects were never actually properly treated for the disease. Now, this went on even after penicillin hit the scene and became the go-to treatment for the infection in 1945, and after rapid treatment centers were established in 1947. Now, despite concerns raised about the ethics of the Tuskegee syphilis study as early as 1936, the study didn't actually end until 1972, after the media reported on the multi-decade experiment and there was subsequent public outrage. Number 9. The human vivisections of Herophilus. Ancient physician Herophilus is considered the father of anatomy, and while he made significant discoveries during his practice, it's how he learned about internal workings of the human body that lands him on this list. Herophilus practiced medicine in Alexandria, Egypt, and for at least about 30 to 40 years, he was allowed to dissect human bodies, which he did publicly, along with contemporary Greek physician and autonomous Aristotle. Under the laws of the time, criminals could be sentenced to dissection and vivisection as a punishment, and it said the father of anatomy not only dissected the dead, but also performed vivisections on an estimated 600 living prisoners. Now, Herophilus made great strides in the study of human anatomy, especially the brain, eyes, liver, circulatory system, nervous system, and reproductive system, during a time in history when dissecting human cadavers was considered an act of discretion of the body. And like today, performing vivisections on living bodies was considered butchery, but at the time it was allowed, and he sure did capitalize off of it. Number 8. The Boston Project. Working with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1953 to 57, Dr. William Sweet, who was the chief neurosurgeon at Harvard's Massachusetts General Hospital, gave uranium injections to 11 cancer patients who were terminally ill, with all but one reportedly suffering from brain tumors. Dr. Sweet was interested in learning how the distribution of uranium affected the body and whether it could be used to treat tumors. In 1995, under testimony, Dr. Sweet claimed that he had consent from his patients for his experiments. However, a lack of supporting documents, as well as the case of one patient who was found unconscious and later died without regaining consciousness or being identified, makes those claims slightly dubious. Number 7. The father of gynecology. Throughout the 1840s, J. Marion Sims, who is often referred to as the father of gynecology, performed surgical experiments on enslaved African women without anesthesia. The women, one of whom was operated on 30 times, suffered from infections and many failed surgeries before they were finally cured. The period which Sims operated on enslaved women between 1845 and 1849 was one of which new practice of anesthesia was not universally accepted as safe and effective. It has also been claimed that he addicted the women in his surgical experiments to morphine, only providing the drugs after the surgery was already completed to make them more compliant. Number 6. The Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. The Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study was a controlled study of the effects of malaria on prisoners of Stateville Penitentiary near Joliet, Illinois, beginning in the 1940s. The study was conducted by the Department of Medicine, now the Pritzker School of Medicine, at the University of Chicago, in conjunction with the United States Army and the U.S. State Department. At the Nuremberg trials, German doctors cited the precedent of the malaria experiments as part of their defense. The study continued at the Stateville Penitentiary for 29 years. In related studies from 1944 to 1946, Dr. Alf Alvring, a nephrologist and professor professor at the University of Chicago Medical School, purposely infected psychiatric patients at the Illinois State Hospital with malaria so that he could test experimental treatments on them. Number 5. The Guatemala Study. In a 1946 to 1948 study in Guatemala, U.S. researchers used prostitutes to infect prison inmates, insane asylum patients, and Guatemalan soldiers with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases to test the effectiveness of penicillin in treating STDs. They later tried infecting people with direct inoculations made from syphilis bacteria poured into the men's private parts and on forearms and faces that were slightly abraded or in a few cases through spinal punctures. Approximately 700 people were infected as part of the study. The study was sponsored by the Public Health Service, the National Institute of Health, the Pan American Healthy Sanitary Bureau, now the World Health Organization, Pan's American Health Organization, and the Guatemalan government. Now, the team was led by John Charles Cutler, who later participated in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Cutler chose to do the study in Guatemala because he would not have been permitted to do it in the United States. In 2012, when the research was revealed, the U.S. officially apologized to Guatemala for the studies. A lawsuit has been launched against Johns Hopkins University, Bristol Myers Squibb, and the Rockefeller Foundation for alleged involvement in the study. Number 4. The Holmesburg Prison Studies. From approximately 1951 to 1974, the Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania was the site of extensive dermatological research operations using prisoners as subjects. Led by Dr. Albert M. Kilman of the University of Pennsylvania, the study was performed on behalf of Dow Chemical Company, the U.S. Army, and Johnson & Johnson. Dow Chemical wanted to study the health effects of dioxin and other herbicides to discover how they affect human skin because workers at its chemical plants were developing chloracne. In the study, Kilman applied about the same amount of dioxin as to which the Dow employees were being exposed. In 1980 and 1981, some of the people who were used in the study sued Kilman because they were suffering from a variety of health problems, including lupus and psychological damage. Kilman later continued his dioxin studies, increasing the dosage of dioxin, which he applied again of 10 prisoners, to 7,500 micrograms of dioxin, which is 468 times the dosage of the Dow chemical official Gerald K. Rowe had authorized him to administer. Now, as a result, the prisoners developed inflammatory pustules and papules, and the Holmesburg program paid hundreds of inmates to test a wide range of cosmetic products and chemical compounds whose health effects were unknown at the time. A 1964 issue of Medical News reported that 9 out of 10 prisoners at Holmesburg Prison were medical test subjects. Number 3. Operation Artichoke. The U.S.'s interest in developing a truth serum began in 1943 when the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, began experimenting with a truth drug, which would produce uninhibited truthfulness in an interrogated person. In studies running from 1947 to 1953, which were known as Project Chatter, the U.S. Navy began identifying and testing truth serums, which they hoped could be used during interrogations of Soviet spies. Now, Operation Artichoke was a CIA-led program that ran from 1951 to 1961 and sought to investigate the use of hypnosis and other forms of psychological manipulation in intelligence gathering and behavior modification. This program was part of the larger MK-Ultra project initiated by the CIA to study the effects of psychological manipulation on human subjects. Specifically, Operation Artichoke aimed to assess the efficiency of hypnosis and other psychological techniques in eliciting information from interrogated individuals. In addition, it also sought to understand how hypnosis could be used in altering a person's memory or behavior for covert operations. Now, despite its potential applications, the program was controversial and eventually discontinued due to ethical conflicts. Number 2. Mustard gas tested on American military. Mustard gas is a type of chemical warfare agent, and as a chemical weapon, mustard gas was first used in World War I. In 1943, the U.S. Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas. Now, officially, the Navy was testing the effectiveness of the new clothing and gas masks against the deadly gas that had proven so terrifying in the First World War. But the worst of the experiments occurred at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. Young men were approached after 8 weeks of boot camp and asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment that would help shorten the war. Now, obviously, they said yes, but they didn't know what they were signing up for. Only when the boys reached the research laboratory were they told the experiment involved mustard gas. In 2015, Rollins Edwards, a soldier, spoke out about going through this experiment. He said, "It felt like you were on fire, guys started screaming and hollering and trying to break out, and then some of the guys fainted. And finally, they opened the door and let us out, and the guys were they were in bad shape." Now, the participants almost all of whom suffered several external and internal burns, were ignored by the Navy, and in some cases threatened with the Espionage Act. In 1991, the reports were finally declassified and taken before Congress. And coming in at number 1 is the Aversion Project. The Aversion Project, led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, identified gay soldiers and conscripts who used drugs in the South African Defense Forces, SADF. Victims were forced to submit to curing their homosexuality because the SADF considered homosexuality to be subversive, and those who were homosexual were subject to punishment. The homosexual undesirables were sent to a military hospital near Pretoria, a place called Ward 22, which in itself sounds terrifying. There, between 1971 and 1989, Dr. Aubrey Levin took care of patients. Now, many victims were subject to chemical castrations and electric shock treatment meant to cure them of their homosexual condition. Dr. Levin used electroconvulsive aversion therapy to reorientate his patients. Electrodes were strapped to the patient's upper arm with wires running to a dial calibrated from 1 to 10. Homosexual men were also shown pictures of naked men and then encouraged to fantasize, at which point the patient was subjected to severe shocks. Now, due to the lack of scientific evidence to prove that these procedures have the ability to alter sexuality, they began declining in frequency during the 1970s, when treatment for homosexual soldiers was no longer supported by the field of mental health. Consequently, the definition of homosexuals as mentally ill was removed from the American Psychiatric Association's manual in 1973, and the treatment was, thankfully, left behind.
Kicking off the list at number 10, the aviator suit. When it comes to new ideas and new inventions, it almost seems messy at first, all the time. It's always a horrible start. And today's list is quite messy, a lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Reichelt, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit. It was a parachute. It was made of 320 square feet of fabric. It wasn't light at all. And in 1912, Franz wanted to test this new invention out in public, but instead of using a dummy and throwing that off the Eiffel Tower, Franz wanted to be brave and he strapped himself in. And the rest is history. Dark, horrible fast history. Number 9. The Hofling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, so a bit more recent, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments, well, didn't really exist. Really. I was gonna say they were kind of loose, but no, they were not really a thing at all. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is totally illegal, very illegal. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher in this scenario. He would ask the nurses to check the medical cabinet to see if they had a drug called Astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was actually just a placebo, so don't worry too much. The Astrogen would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the papers later and all that jazz. This just had to get done that night. This had to be delivered to the patient ASAP. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. Big 2. And it was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital in the first place. Big 3 red flags right there. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Yikes. To be fair, that's the entire point of this test. This is nothing towards the nurses. I'm not ripping on them at all. I mean, this was 1966. We didn't know quite a bit back in the day, you know what I mean? This really showed the pressure nurses are put under randomly in the middle of the night, if anything. Number 8, UCLA schizophrenia experiment. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Neutraline went to great and pretty unethical lengths just to see how people who are suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Yeah, basically they're trying to figure out if there is a way to predict the relapse, or a psychosis episode of some sorts. Now, sounds like a good idea on paper, I guess, but the way you go about things, historically, come on, we could have done a lot better. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia at the time, and then just taking them off their meds completely. Yeah, as I said that, you at home probably went, ooh, yeah, that's exactly right. What a horrible idea. Like, we're going the opposite way here. We're not supposed to do this, right? There's no suitable plan and order for when they could return to their medication. And they also didn't do a good job making sure these patients were actually safe during these experiments. They're like, yeah, let's just take people off their meds, see what happens. It's horrible. It's one of the worst. Unfortunately, the results were as bad as you thought and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio Lamadrid, ended up taking his own life. Again, not sure what we expected here in this sense. An article from 1994 also said that doctors failed to get proper consent from the patients as well. Just a cherry on top of this horrible experiment. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. There you go. Number 7. Psychic driving. British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron is to blame for this one. Remember that name. Don't listen to anything he says. He created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting, to say the least. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous, repeated audio loop of something that's intended to change their behavior. Just the same line or the same whatever over and over thousands of times. And through the course of their treatment, they would also be paralyzed while being exposed to the loop message. Yeah, the worst thing ever, right? So the CIA heard about this and started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a fake name. Classic CIA. Cameron would subject patients to paralytics and electroconvulsive therapy, stronger than usual as well, just to make things worse, just at a horrible limit. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents' names and thought that the interrogators were actually their real parents. Just horrible things. Their minds were just so confused. Brutal stuff. Number 6, go pills. Here in Toronto, we have go trains, go buses, but not go pills. Not yet. Hopefully not ever, actually. Yeah, move over 5-hour energy. We got some competition on the horizon. Staying awake is challenging, even when you're doing something you absolutely enjoy, like watching a movie. You'll still fall asleep. It just happens, we're human. My dad fell asleep in a theater once in the moving chairs. I couldn't believe it. Guy's 3D glasses were falling off of his face. I was in shock. But he works a lot. He works crazy hours, he's older. That's where go pills were supposed to come in handy. Workers who have these long shifts and work late hours to pay the bills. This pill was supposed to keep you up for 40 hours straight, so a bit much, I'd say. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, which is much less air coming out of my mouth, is currently funding this pill. But what if it's mistreated? I can't even begin to imagine the negative effects something like this could have on people. We could barely handle Tide Pods as a community. You know what I mean? It's kind of a bad idea, I vote. Number 5. The Milgram experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test, for example, and how that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and why these people did this, or more so how people are influenced into doing these horrible things historically, especially in large numbers. So the Milgram experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions, specifically if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test. There's 3 important roles for this one. You need the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're actually in on the whole thing. The real subject is over here. The teacher, the one administering pain to the test subjects. So they're told by this higher figure, whoever, to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They're like the rule maker. So the real test here is to see how far humans will go when hurting others under direct authority. It's important to note that the subject also isn't actually getting shocked at all. Again, they're in on it. They play it up. They play it up more and more just to see what's going on. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. In college, I did improv. That's wild. That's a wild after-school curricular activity. Number 4, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrible experiments during World War II that certainly are going to shock anyone who learns about them. This is wild. This definitely belongs on this list. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was horrible and extremely inhumane, as are most of these things. Different medical schools and universities all provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments. Big group effort, nice, way to go guys. They used both prisoners and civilians as test subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens like cholera or anthrax, or operations with just no anesthesia, just weapon testing, all painful stuff, really the worst of the worst. Number 3, MK Ultra. We have to include a mind control project. Do you believe in mind control? Some claim they're born with it, like an X-Men, so if that's you, you know where to meet. MK Ultra, where do I start? Okay, it was originally a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973, where they ran hundreds of experiments to US citizens. They gave them hallucinogens in an attempt to crack mind control, or sorry, as they called it, information gathering. Yeah, it's like what Apple says. Oh, we're just gathering information. Yeah, okay. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and or North Korean agents were all using mind control in the war. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. Yeah, it's gotta be brainwashing, nothing else, right? Horrible tests were being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, in prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was a huge, horrible secret. The agency destroyed most MK documents back in 1973 when it officially ended, so we think we know, when in reality we probably know little to nothing what actually occurred. Number 2, the Stanford prison experiment. Perhaps the most famous psychological experiment gone wrong. The Stanford prison experiment. Let's talk about it. It started August 14th, 1971. It was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Again, another university study. My gosh. I mean, to be fair, Hogwarts was also messed up, but Hogwarts wasn't real now, was it? The Stanford prison experiment was very real. The experiment took volunteers and divided them into 2 groups. One group of prisoners and one group of guards. And they placed all these volunteers into a fake prison that was created for the experiment, okay? The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil, under the right conditions, of course, with the right amount of power. Yeah, pretty twisted, right? It's basically a group version of the Milgram experiment. It was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. And after just 6 days, we found out. Yeah, 6 days later, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners in the worst ways possible. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of, even after just a short amount of time, less than a week. And humans are like, oh, I'll be evil. And finally, coming in number 1, facial expressions experiment. Yep, a wild one to close her off. The facial expressions experiment. Okay, back in 1924, a psychologist with, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota, classic university stuff, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say sounds a little silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were all the exact same. Does happiness look the same on everybody? Does sadness? What about fear or shock, disgust, anger? What about those? So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. And then he exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions. He wanted to compare all these results side by side. The stimuli at hand was intense. This guy wanted big reactions. He included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course horrible things that I can't talk about here on the tube of you. You know what I mean? Horrible, horrible stuff. All in the name of facial expressions. What an awful experiment, what a dark one. Kicking off the list at number 10, glowfish. I never had a fish tank growing up, but if I did, I probably wouldn't want any hybrid glowy fish bouncing around in there, that's for sure. I don't know. That's what lava lamps are for, no? That's a completely different vibe. You'd be doing this while you're trying to sleep, trying to dodge out glowfish. Back in 2012, while the world was otherwise, preoccupied with not dying or whatever was supposed to happen in 2012, Yorktown Technologies created a hybrid glowfish. They were first created out of zebrafish, but now there's a whole plethora of glowfish that you can purchase, not just the zebra kind. We got tiger barbs, we got rainbow shark, and betta. I don't know what betta is, but we got them, and they're glowy. We figured out how to make them glowy, I guess to hype up Avatar 2. I think that was supposed to come out back then. I don't see why we needed hybrid glowfish, but here we are. Bioluminescence is natural. We see octopus or deep sea fish that have it naturally, that's cool. But when it's not natural, you can tell, you know what I mean? It looks plasticky, it looks not right. Scientists in Singapore were originally aiming to modify fish to spot toxins in polluted water easier. But then on one hand, you're like, they're pretty mesmerizing. They're glowy, we like them, they're cute. Alan Blake, co-founder of said Yorktown Technologies, wanted them to glow only when near toxins. Yeah, this was back in 2003 when they first started. The guy wanted real life toxin notifications in the water. That's crazy. Oh, toxins, there we go. Good idea, but like, there's other ways, I think. Also, don't fish love shiny things? These guys would be lunch in like a matter of minutes. Today we're at a point where glowfish are being sold to houses for reasons. Do you want a glowfish? I wouldn't be able to sleep. I don't want any part of that. It doesn't affect them in any way. It doesn't hurt. Apparently their skin just changes. I don't know. That kind of feels like a big deal to me. I'd be like, what's going on? Help. Number 9, see-through frog. Yeah, just when you thought frogs were already hard to spot and catch, boom. Now they're invisible, pal. Good luck. Back in 2016, through artificial insemination, scientists successfully took the DNA of 2 kinds of recessive color mutant frogs. They took black-eyed and gray-eyed frogs, and then they did science. That's what they did. They just smacked them together and they're like, whoa, that was so easy. They combined them together to create a frog whose skin is always translucent. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason for this. It's cool, but there's also a reason. The see-through factor allows observation of organ growth or cancer formation without having to cut into them. You know what I mean? Kind of helps when you can see the problem, right? No dissection needed for further study. That was the goal here. Not bad. But imagine being see-through at all times. I'd be like, hey pal, my eyes are up here, okay? Quit staring at my pancreas. Gotta move on. Number 8. Savannah cats. This one has been talked about for a while now. It's pretty common, weirdly enough. How do we feel about Savannah cats? Let's talk about these little critters. In May 2012, the International Cat Association, I want to work there, first of all, they registered this Savannah cat as a new official breed. It's official! The international cat community confirmed it. And it all started in the late 80s when Judy Frank crossbred a male several with a domestic Siamese. The offspring was appropriately named Savannah. Yeah. Imagine if I was like, no, it's actually Amanda. I lied to you. They just called them Savannah cats for no reason. In turn, now we have cats with big ears. We did it, folks. We did it. Domestic cats mixed with wild African cats. I mean, it sounds like you're gonna get another cat. And we did. Great work. I don't know how to tell you this. I mean, apparently they're great. They're not too crazy temper-wise, but they're fun and energetic at the same time. Apparently they're great for families. Yeah, I can't believe I'm saying great for families in a list that gets as dark as it's gonna get. Number 7, the Zorse. The Zorse. Yes, the male zebra, female horse. Now we get a really fun word. Zorse. The Zorse. Sorry. It sounds like a god. Yeah, there's Thor, Odin, and then Zorse. Zebroids, that's their scientific name, they're usually quite common historically. Charles Darwin even noted some in his work. So since the 19th century, crossbreeding zebras with horses, donkeys, you name it, has been done. More often than not, and this is what makes them stand out, zebroids will experience dwarfism. So they're very little petite little guys. In 2010, a zedonk was born. It was a zebra donkey, but again, back in the 70s, this happened before, and no one really talked about it. There were 3 born in Colchester Zoo. Yeah, those zookeepers were like, how do we make zoos new and hip? Bizarre. Humans are so weird. They're not too smart, humans. They're like, yeah, let's put these in a cage. It'll be fine. Number 6, bees. I hate bees so much. When the window's closed, we're good. Remember when we had to worry about killer bees for a couple months, like a year ago? During an already dark time? Should we still be worried? Are these killer bees coming back? Are they a real thing? Hybrid bees? Those are also, Will hybrid bees fight the killer bees? Can we watch this? Can we tune in and watch this on Triller? An experiment in the 70s tried to change the hashtag bee game, and in turn, we got a brand new bee. Yeah, we love those. Just new bees to dodge outside. The idea at first was to take a regular honeybee and then breed it with an African honeybee. Ideally, we would get a hybrid bee that can safely provide more honey than a regular honeybee. Okay, that's steps. We're going towards the future with this one, right? On paper. The experiment obviously didn't work with these new bees, and they didn't do that at all. And worst part of all, the bees got out. Yeah, imagine that email. To whom it may concern. Oh God, I left the door open, I'm sorry. These bees are aggressive towards other kinds of bees. They're not too nice, they're not too friendly. And they're very aggressive towards humans as well, in case you were wondering. And when these bees sting, their stinger stays with them afterwards so they can continue stinging multiple times with their stinger butts. Yeah, they don't fall off, right? That's our only hope when we see a bee the size of a tennis ball. We're like, he won't, will he? Will he? I don't think. These bees would. Because they can. Yeah, hybrid killer bees. Victims have received 10 times the amount of stings as regular swarms. It's a lot of stings. It's a lot of movements from the bee's hips there. That's like some Caesar. That's like the Julius Caesar numbers right there. That's crazy. They react to disturbances 10 times faster, and they will also chase said disturbance a quarter of a mile to find it. So yeah, don't sneeze. These bees have caused over 1,000 deaths, so yeah, I guess we should worry. We should definitely worry. Hit that thumbs up just because we're like, no, there's no good in this. That's scary, that's so scary. Hit that thumbs up for bee progression. Let's save the bees. Hit the thumbs up for the bees. Let's save all the bees except for those kind. The other ones are good. Number 5, Tigons. Tigons be bygones. Haha. He's good. I was gonna say liger, but that's been used before. We know what that one looks like. Tigons were a real hybrid animal you could see for yourself at both the London Zoo and the Manchester Zoo once upon a time. This was of course back in the late 30s where folks didn't, bat an eye towards these kind of things with animals. Yeah, step on up and see the Tigon. A tiger head, a lion body, and a tiger tail. That's what happens when you put animals in the same cage. Come on out. Well, sometimes they'll get along too well in said cage, and then you'll get a Tigon. Tigon hybrids were seen long before the 90s. Actually, in 1837, Queen Victoria was gifted a Tigon. Imagine that. I wouldn't know what to do with that. I'd be like, hi, what are you? Number 4, Hiromitsu Nakachi, stem cell biologist from Tokyo. This one is insane. Now we're getting to the dark ones here. Just recently, his experiments have been approved by the government, so things are actively in play here, not just, Farmer Joe in the early 1900s. No, this is modern science. This is some Black Mirror type stuff here. Hiromitsu hopes to grow human cells inside of mice and rats, and then transplant said embryos into surrogate animals. A lot of animals, a lot of cells, a lot of traffic, a lot of moving around, and a lot of science, apparently. Cells into rats and mice embryos. How did we even get here? Who thought of this first? We went from the Salem witch trials to rodents being genetically manipulated so they can make pancreases for themselves. I like the word pancreas. I've been using it a few times lately. But his hope was that the rodent bodies would use the human cells to then make a pancreas for themselves. Here's the thing though, while conducting said experiments, they found that the rats were starting to develop a human-type brain. That's when they pulled the plug on that entire project. Yeah, the second humans and animals get too close, governments will come in and go, stop. Number 3, Beefalo. Beefalo sounds like a Pokemon. It sounds like a thing that's close to being real but shouldn't be, and that's where it should have stayed, if I'm being honest. The Beefalo should have only been a concept. But then a guy named Charles Buffalo Jones did the impossible. Look at him go. One day in 1906, he said, hey, watch this, and then started breeding Arizona bison with domestic cattle in order to produce a hardy commercial animal, just something new to make some money. He ended up giving up on this project entirely, and then he just released the animals. Yeah, guy just got bored and released science projects to the wilds. What could go wrong? The Beefalo then found their way into a national park where hunting was banned, so they thrived. And they thrived without natural predators at that. The population began to grow by 50% every single year, and at first you're like, wow, we did it. This is like Jurassic Park, but cute. No, their environmental impact was horrible. It was not ideal. They played God. They messed with the circle of life. You eat one bug, then there's a hurricane somewhere else. First off, these guys are very thirsty animals. They can consume 10 gallons of water each trip to a watering hole. They're like that one kid growing up drinking at the water fountain. You're like, guy, save some. Please hurry. I'm so thirsty. Yeah, they drank all the water. Every animal was so thirsty after. They also in said water, so they ruined the entire water park for every other animal involved. Yeah, all bad. Entire ecosystems were messed up at this point. Everybody got thirsty because Charles Buffalo Jones was like, hey, watch this. Let's try something new. Number 2, don't try this at home. Not sure how many times I have to say this, but don't try any crossbreeding at home. Or ever, for that matter. Because things go south, obviously. For example, back in 2010, a woman named Julie Leroy was working as an animal control officer when an owner of a pit bull puppy said that she didn't want to keep her. This is normal. Maybe a kid will come into the picture, maybe the dog's too aggressive, whatever, and then they have to give it back. Okay. When Julie saw the dog, she was in shock. She was like, yeah, I'll take this living animal, first of all. I'm not a monster, thank you, I can do this. People who abandon animals, also, they're the devil. Side note. This dog was different, but it wasn't mean. It was just a hybrid. It wasn't healthy, but all the more reason why you should stick around. Know what I mean? The dog had a squished body, it had a huge jaw, and a bad underbite, and it was oddly shaped. That's because the dog suffered from short spine syndrome. That's because they got the dog from this backyard breeder who was carelessly breeding a bunch of dogs together, just for fun, not really knowing what he's doing. Thankfully, Julie did know what she was doing. She brought the dog home and gave her a loving home. Sweet little thing. Olivia and I want a dog so badly, so you know what? We'll take this hybrid little lady anytime. Her name's Kuda. She's in great hands, but look at her, she's so cute. And finally, number 1, lions. Back in the 80s, the Chatbar Zoo in Chandigarh, India, they tried this fun little science experiment for themselves. Yeah, they tried an experimental program rather, where they would breed together domestic lions, little petite, well, small in terms of a lion. They would mix them with these massive, beastly African lions in the hopes that they would meet in the middle somewhere and be introduced to the wild and help with the dying population of wild lions in India. Again, on paper, we wanted to get involved, we want to help restructure the lives of this animal, but the zoo found 2 African lions that were being used in a circus and then brought them in to breed with their 2 Asiatic lions. And it didn't. Obviously, it's number 1. It didn't work. When the cubs were born, it was clear that this was already a mistake. The cubs had weak back legs, they were having extreme trouble walking, and as they got older, their immune systems just started to fail faster and faster. By 2000, they'd bred more than 70 of these hybrid lions. That's a lot of projects, a lot of experiments. So they finally decided to stop the program, thankfully, and all the males were given vasectomies in order to stop any further reproduction, which is so odd to me. Like, I'm not a fan of humans at all at this point. They're like, hey, welcome to Earth. Yeah, it kind of sucks, right? It's hot. Okay, cool. We're gonna stop making you now. Cheers. Well, naturally, thankfully, there are laws that prohibit officials from just killing these animals, so now they're just simply waiting for them to die naturally, which is, it's better. It's certainly better, but still, stop messing with nature, guys. How many times do I have to tell you? Stop messing with nature. Starting our list off at number 10, Ilya Ivanov. Beginning in the late 1800s, here we go. Soviet biologists, they actually got permission from the country to breed hybrid ape humans. What did you get up to last summer? I'll never tell. She grafted an ovary into a chimp, and the goal was to fertilize Nora, the chimp, with human DNA. So they inseminated a group of chimps. None of them got pregnant, so instead they tried to flip the project up. Now this time, they had a human inseminated with the DNA of chimps. Yeah, the other way around. The volunteer number was low, obviously. Now before anything actually happened, this would have been an absolute train wreck. Before the project was underway, he was sent away to Kazakhstan. So we didn't get any more science projects after that point, thankfully. Yeah, let's just leave monkeys alone. Number 9, human-monkey hybrid. Guys, I wish this was fake, but it's not. So scientists, they're currently trying to make human-monkey hybrids, like the title just said. They have high hopes that these experiments will succeed because monkeys and humans are similar genetically. So obviously, we're gonna try a few times. Spanish biologist Juan Carlos Esbizula Belmonte is working with monkey researchers in China right now to perform these experiments. So basically they're mixing human cells into monkey embryos and then they're just gonna see what happens, I guess. I don't know. Hope it goes well. Their objective is to grow a monkey whose organs are completely made of human cells. Doesn't that sound just terrifying when I say it out loud like that? Then they would use said animals and their organs for people that need them. Yeah, of course this is a little bit controversial in a few ways, so let's just keep moving on. Number 8, Jose Delgado. Okay, we're talking about mind control, so give you a moment to put on your tinfoil hats. You might need those for this one. In the early 1900s, Jose Delgado graduated from the University of Madrid. Even lands a professorship at Yale University, but his mind, the whole time, his mind was focused on others. He had other ideas going on. He was committed to mind control, and his go-to method was implants. Yeah, electrode implants, first used with, you guessed it, primates. Yeah, 3 for 3. Weird. He would use a remote control to make them do certain moves, even, moving on to mind controlling a bull. So he was kind of changing the animal game up as he went. He liked to improvise. He got in the ring with said mind controlled bull, but then oddly enough, the bull was calm. It didn't attack. That's weird. Almost like there's an implant in his brain and he doesn't want to do anything. Reports say he stopped the bull last second before it charged. I call bull. I say there's a thing in his head and he wasn't sure what was up the entire time, little poor lad. And then next in the project line came the people. 25 people were tested on with said mind control device. Yeah, by electronically controlling the brain. He believes armies could be controlled down the road, and until his death in 2011, he was upset that he wasn't cited as often in terms of mind control project in recent studies. Yeah, weird. Guy who mind controlled animals in the 1900s. We're trying not to do that maybe. I don't know. That's why we're not talking about you. Number 7, see-through frogs. Here we go. Just when you thought frogs were already hard to spot, boom, now they're invisible. Good luck catching them. Back in 2016, through artificial insemination, scientists successfully took the DNA of 2 kinds of recessive color frogs, black-eyed frogs and gray-eyed frogs. Then they combined them together to create a frog whose skin is now always translucent. They made an X-Men of a frog. We love it. The see-through factor allows observation of organ growth or cancer formation. That's the human science thing. And it kind of helps when you can see the problem, I guess. No dissection needed for further study, right? Just looking through you. That's pretty intrusive. I don't know. Imagine being see-through all the time. Like, hey pal, my eyes are up here. Quit staring at my pancreas. Number 6, Tigons. Let Tigons be bygones. Let's never do this ever, please. I was gonna say liger, but that's been used before. We all know what that one looks like. Tigons were a real hybrid animal that you could see for yourself at both the London Zoo and the Manchester Zoo at one point in history. This was of course back in the late 30s, where folks didn't bat an eye towards these kind of projects or these kind of things. Yeah, step on up and see the Tigon, a tiger head and a lion body, and a tiger tail, all together to make a big old pile of holy. Yeah, that's what happens when you put animals in the same cage. Sometimes they get along a little too well. Tigon hybrids were seen long before the 90s as well. In 1837, for example, Queen Victoria was gifted a Tigon. That's odd. They're like flowers or a hybrid creature. What do we give the Queen? Number 5, DIY. Not sure how many times I have to say this in life, but don't try any crossbreeding at home, or ever for that matter. Thanks. Keep it up. Because things obviously go south. For example, back in 2010, a woman named Julie Leroy, she was working as an animal control officer when an owner of a pit bull puppy said she didn't want to keep her. Okay, this happens often. But when Julie saw the dog, she was in complete disbelief. She was like, yeah, I'll take this living animal. I'm not a monster. I can commit to this for sure. Thanks. People who abandon animals also, you're the devil. Don't do that. This dog, it was a hybrid animal. It wasn't healthy, but all the more reasons why you should stick around. The dog had a squished up body, a huge jaw, and a bad underbite, and it was oddly shaped. But you gotta love him still. Look, he's so cute. God, I want him. Little bread dude. That's because the dog suffered from short spine syndrome. That's because they got the dog from a backyard breeding place who was carelessly breeding a bunch of these dogs together. Just no effort at all. No care. Thankfully, Julie did bring the dog home and gave her a loving time. Sweet little thing. Olivia and I want a dog so badly. I would definitely take this little hybrid lady in a heartbeat, for sure. A little bread bed for her. Oh, I love dogs, even if they're, hybrid and created in the backyard. Number 4, glowfish. I never had a fish tank growing up. I don't know, not sure how I felt about a starfish just watching me sleep for hours on end. Back in 2012, Yorktown Technologies created hybrid glowfish. They were first created from zebrafish, but now there's a whole plethora of glowfish that you can purchase. Tiger barbs, rainbow sharks, you name it, everything is glowy now. I guess to hype up Avatar 2, I don't know. I don't see why we needed hybrid glowfish. Why are we doing this? Can we stop? Bioluminescence is natural. We see octopus or deep sea fish that have it naturally. Scientists in Singapore were originally aiming to modify fish to spot toxins in polluted water in an easier way. Cool. But on one hand, you're like, oh, these fish are pretty beautiful. They're glowy. Can I have one, please? Alan Blake, co-founder of said Yorktown Technologies, wanted them to glow only when near toxins. Now, this was back in 2003 when they first started. Guy wanted real-life notifications in the water. Cool. Today, we're at a point where glowfish are just being sold to houses for reasons. Just because. Do you want a glowfish? I don't know. Am I the only one that's like out of the loop with like the glowy fish vibe? Comment down below if a glowfish is something you want or now want. Oops, sorry. Number 3, Savannah cats. This one's been talked about for a while now. How do we feel about Savannah cats? I want to hear about this one as well. In May 2012, the International Cat Association registered this Savannah cat as a new breed. It's official, we got a new cat. Just what the world needs. More cats. I'm allergic, so, pardon my beef. The international cat community confirms it. Now, it all started in the late 80s when Judy Frank crossbred a male several with a domestic Siamese. The offspring, in turn, was appropriately named Savannah. Yeah, now we have cats with big ass ears, and they're so cute. I can't help it, they are so cute. Domestic cats mixed with wild African cats. I mean, it sounds like you're gonna get a cat. I don't know how to tell you. This is like a science experiment that they're like, oh, it worked. And apparently they're great. Apparently they're not too crazy temper-wise, but they're fun and they're energetic. Great for families. Who knew? Better than glowfish. Any day. Any day. Number 2, pig human. Scientists at the Salk Institute for Biological Scientists, what a mouthful that was, have created a human-pig hybrid. Yeah, in 2017, when worlds collide, let's do it. An embryo was placed in an adult pig for 4 weeks, and then when it was taken out and further analyzed, the embryos, not only one survived, but they also contained some human cells. So their hope now was to grow human organs inside of pigs, instead of, waiting for a donor. Impatient, but okay, we're listening. In 1910, zoologists figured out that it might even be possible to create hybrids between humans and their closest relatives as well. Yeah, no matter how this ends, either Planet of the Apes or Planet of the Pigs, I did my part, okay? I recycled. I didn't f with animal DNA, like Jurassic Park. I just kinda got a job. I don't know. Hands are clean. And finally, number 1, Stubbins Firth. We saved Firth for first. Let's do it. This is one of the craziest science projects I've ever heard of, so buckle up. Stubbins Firth, a researcher from Pennsylvania back in the late 1700s. First of all, as you could probably guess, methods back in the 1700s were often messy and pretty much illegal in every way. Firth was a doctor in training at the time, and he decided to prove to the world that yellow fever was not contagious. Yeah, imagine if you had Twitter. Firth would surgically insert vomit from his patients with yellow fever. He would insert vomit into his body. He would insert all their yuck into his wounds, all over his face, his eyes, you name it. He was trying to get it. He was going the extra, I'm gonna throw up. He was going the extra mile, all in the name of medical research. Even urine and saliva too. Anything yucky, he was rubbing it in. Firth, to all of our surprise, did not get sick. He was proud of that one. He told everybody the news loudly. He mansplained it at like 4 a.m. We look back now though and we realize Firth just sampled late stage patients, so they were further along. Much further, say, than the contagious period. So basically he volunteered to dump all the on his, yeah, science. History is gross. Science as well. Gets a little messy sometimes. Number 10, back pain. We'll kick this list off with a horrific prison deal, okay? Around the early 1970s, a lot of experiments rather, they would involve prisoners. And more often than not, they were considered horrible and inhumane. Congressional hearings in 1973 revealed some shady stuff about these pharmaceutical industry. Officials were actually using prisoners for testing because they were cheaper than chimpanzees at the time. Yeah, they were cheaper than animal testing. That's a loaded sentence. That's all bad right there. Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia specifically, they were a hot one. They did this a lot, sadly. Edward Yusef Anthony, a prisoner at the time who was actually featured in a book about all these horrible studies, he says he agreed to have a layer of skin peeled off of his back, which was then coated with searing chemicals in order to test this pharmaceutical. He did that for money to buy cigarettes in prison. It's terrible. He recalled weeks of intense itching and agonizing pain. I can't even imagine. All while serving time too. That's like the most bad. That's all bad. Number 9, Guatemala studies. The Guatemala study is, again, horrible, as are all of these in this list, but I can't even imagine dealing with something life-altering already, like a prison sentence, and then having to be a test subject on top of that. This is just torture at that point. The study began in 1946. American scientists gathered not just prisoners, but patients as well, all residing in a mental hospital in Guatemala. They were then infected with syphilis in order to test whether penicillin could prevent STDs. The study was, of course, useless. It led to nothing but sickness for those that were forced to be involved. In a lot of these cases, many patients didn't fully understand what was happening. They couldn't give their full consent, of course. That's why they sadly went to them. Because nobody in their healthy mind would ever agree to something like this ever. It's disgusting. Number 8, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 71 conducted horrific experiments during World War II that definitely make the list. These experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome, of course, and extremely inhumane. Different medical schools and even universities provided these doctors and other research staff all to help conduct these experiments. There was a nice group effort done, and they used both prisoners and, again, civilians who didn't fully understand as subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments here that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them purposely with pathogens. They would purposely inject them with cholera or anthrax or perform operations without using any anesthesia. It was the worst of the worst. It all happened in Unit 731. Number 7, stomach test. Okay, I'll try and keep this list a little bit of a lighter note here. I'll try and bump it up a bit. This one's not as bad, if such a thing exists. Back in 1822, a fur trader in Michigan was accidentally hit in the stomach. But the trader was lucky to be treated by one Dr. William Beaumont. The fur trader survived, which already was a surprise given the, damage. But now they had this opened hole. They had this wound in his stomach that never heals. Now, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity allowed a good peek at the digestive process. I feel so sick. I had breakfast 14 minutes ago. Awesome. So Dr. Beaumont began conducting experiments. He's like, let's use this horrible situation for science. He wanted to know how the stomach worked, so he would tie food to a string and then insert said yum-yums through the hole in the trader's stomach. And then every few hours he would just pop the food out to observe how it had been digested. I feel so sick talking about this. Now that's the grossest thing I've ever heard personally, but these experiments did lead us to a worldwide knowledge that digestion was a chemical and not a mechanical process. So, guy's just stuffing pierogies in homeboy's stomach. He's like, someone ate it. I'm gonna throw up. Number 6, Operation Midnight Climax. Sounds like a funny name, but it's really not funny at all. Back in the 1950s, the CIA launched Operation Midnight Climax, ideally to study the effects of mind-altering substances on individuals. So in San Francisco and New York, subjects who again did not give consent or really know what was happening, they were tricked into participating. They were lured into safe houses by the, ladies of the night, but these women were actually secretly on the CIA's payroll. Yeah, they were calling in. They would work for the CIA secretly. They would give out these mind-altering substances, and then they would secretly watch from behind one-way glass. This was all found out and later thankfully shut down in 1965, and the CIA was busted for 1, blackmail, 2, surveillance technology, and 3, the use of mind-altering substances on the field. Yeah, can't do any of those. Number 5, Bobby, Eddie, and David. When Bobby Shafran was 19 years old, he found out that he had a twin this whole time. He found out he had a brother named Eddie. Now, this is usually fun, but, well, hang on here. The two were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households, of course. But not too long after finding out about each other, things took a crazier turn when Bobby and Eddie found out they had another twin, a triplet rather, another brother named David. So it should have been a very joyous reunion for these triplets turned dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they'd spent all those years not knowing that each other existed this whole time. They were forced to be subjects in an experiment that they had no idea was taking place their entire lives, just in the background. Peter Newbar was a psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but he decided to do it in a cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving in life if they were separated from their pair, and they wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddie, and David all found each other. Their story is documented in the movie The Three Identical Strangers. Number 4. MK Ultra. Okay, where do I even start with this one? This was a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973. It's a very long time. They ran hundreds and hundreds of experiments to US citizens, and they gave them all mind-altering substances, you know, stuff I can't really say, all in attempts to crack mind control, or as they called it back then, information gathering. Nice. Hey, just hit that link down below. We're gonna gather some information. Keep your location on. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and North Korean agents were all using mind control, right? Why, of course. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. So these horrible tests were then being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, even prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was this huge, deep, long secret, and the agency destroyed most MK documents back in '73 when it ended. So we think we know a good amount, but there's probably so much horrible shit that we have no idea. Facial expressions experiment. Back in 1924, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota who wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions and why we do them, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little bit silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of all these emotions were all the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone's face? What about sadness? Or fear? Or shock? But what about disgust or anger or excruciating pain? Yeah, all those dark ones too, you gotta look at. So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then he painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions and then compare the results. This is like a DC villain, this is horrible. This is all fine, I guess, except for what the stimuli actually contained. He wanted huge reactions because he included showing them adult films, exposing them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course he made them do horrible, inhumane things that I can't even talk about here on YouTube. All in the name of facial expressions and if they matched others. Number 2. The Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. Now, in a sort of mental health study, I guess if you want to call it that, Henry decided to induce depression into monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and their families and their mothers and put them into an isolation cage that was called the Pit of Despair. They even gave it a sad human name, like why just call it like the test cage. I don't know, so sad. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple, shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed, of course, after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before it started. Now, these monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get even sadder, dare I say, than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and then rehabilitated. They just stayed depressed. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place that they would have been had, they not been subjected to a cruel experiment. And finally, number 1, the Aversion Project. During the apartheid era in South Africa, psychologist Dr. Aubrey Levin was put in charge of curing gay men. Now, what I mean by that is that he was in charge of running these cruel experiments that targeted gay men for absolutely zero reason. There's zero science here at all. Guy's just a piece of shit. So sadly, thousands of gay men were imprisoned at the military hospital near Pretoria. And while they were there, they were subjected to electroconvulsive aversion therapy that was said to, again, reorient them, right? Now, part of this cruel therapy involves showing the men photos of naked males, encouraging them to fantasize, and then immediately subjecting them to severe shocks. Again, a horrible experiment that was based on zero scientific knowledge and purely based on hatred that was conducted by one horrible person. Now, once apartheid ended, this guy left South Africa because he was worried about being named as someone who denied people their human rights, but unfortunately he ended up fleeing over to Canada, where he then somehow found work as a doctor. Right here in Canada, where we're filming. We'll end on that terrifying note.
Number 10. Stubbins Firth. When the yellow fever epidemic broke out in Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania was conscripted to help find a cure. One of their many prestigious doctors was a man by the name of Stubbins Firth, and this man had a mission. He was determined to understand the root cause of the disease, and nothing would stop him from ensuring that this evil was defeated. Firth theorized that yellow fever was not a contagious disease, but instead related to the heat of the summer. To prove this, Firth decided that he would perform an experiment with himself as the subject. Firth then smeared himself in the bodily waste of patients infected with yellow fever, rubbing it into cuts on his arms, pouring it in his eyes, frying it and inhaling the fumes, and when that all didn't work, he just ate it. And well, he didn't catch the disease. However, it didn't actually end up proving anything about the disease, as the samples had come from already recovered patients. Years later, after his death, Cuban scientist Carlos Finlay would then correctly attribute the root of the disease to mosquitoes. Number 9. Paracelsus, a deeply important figure to the world of medicine. Paracelsus was a Swiss doctor, philosopher, and just general weirdo. One of the key figures during the German Renaissance, he's known as the father of toxicology and a practitioner of Hermeticism, wandering around the world before eventually taking up residency in Germany and teaching from the University of Basel. He was reportedly quite unstable, frequently under the influence of spirits, refusing to accept conventional medicine, and outright burning books he didn't like in protest, and just, generally being a little freak. He claimed, get ready for this one, that it was possible to grow a man by fermenting sperm inside of a jar of horse dung, an experiment which he carried an example of with wherever he went. Number 8. Jose Delgado. Alright, everyone else on this list is pretty evil. The last two were just, kind of funny. Jose Delgado was a Spanish doctor who worked out of Yale University. His research, on the other hand, was deeply disturbing. The neurologist's primary interest focused around the stimulation of responses in the brain using electricity, which he hoped to be able to use to force the brain to produce the thoughts and emotions that he wanted. In other words, actual mind control. And if that isn't terrifying enough, he also ran experiments on anyone he could find, which usually ended up being people who were either schizophrenic or epileptic. One of his more famous experiments was the one where he used a remote control device to make a bull stop its charge. Number 7. Robert Liston. Liston is an infamous surgeon who worked in the Victorian era. He quickly earned a reputation for being the fastest knife in the West End, and being able to amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. That did happen, by the way, and the patient died of gangrene. He also amputated one of his assistant's fingers for some reason, and they also died of gangrene. Oh, and then, for some inexplicable reason, he lashed out at a surgical spectator who died from shock. What? Either way, Liston was also known as the first surgeon to use anesthesia in Europe, so... Wait, no, what? Number 6. Giovanni Aldini. If you don't know this guy, you'll know who he inspired. An Italian physician, Aldini worked primarily in the application of galvanism to the medical profession, which was the study of passing electricity through the nervous system to induce movement. His most famous experiment was in how he stimulated movement in the body of an executed criminal in London, which was recorded by the Newgate Calendar. Quote, "On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye actually opened." The report goes on to describe how the legs and hands were moved as well. A fearful visage for any bystander. Number 5. Andrew Ure. But this inspiration didn't just stop with Aldini. Where the Italian walk, Ure sprinted. Working as a professor of natural philosophy, Ure would establish himself as a well-respected scientist with a wide variety of focuses that he could claim mastery over. However, when Ure was approached by his friend and professor of anatomy, James Jeffrey, to aid in an experiment, Ure's writings on what happened next would catapult him into fame. Jeffrey had been working on a similar experiment to Aldini's, using the body of a criminal as a test subject and stimulating movement through the phrenic nerve. In 1819, Ure would record an incident where Jeffrey would display his discovery to the public, first moving limbs, then stimulating the eyes to open, and finally causing the contortions of muscles in the face to create terrifying expressions. Members of the crowd reportedly sprinted from the room in horror, and one man was even recorded to have fainted. Number 4. Robert Nelson. One of the stranger entries on this list, Nelson's experiments could be argued as something between evil and just misguided. As it turns out, that division is pretty hard to define, as Bob Nelson's ultimate end goal was the ability to resurrect anyone. Starting as a TV repairman, Nelson would partner with an actual doctor by the name of Dante Brunel, and they would begin to develop a machine to preserve people in an early form of cryostasis. Putting out a call for subjects, they found themselves with an offer from James Bedford, a professor dying of kidney cancer which had metastatized into his lungs. As Bedford passed through legal death, Nelson and Brunel went about preserving his body with the hopes that he could be resurrected when the cure for cancer was discovered. Pumping his blood full of antifreeze, they stored the body in Alcor, the first of what would later number in the hundreds. Number 3. Robert G. Heath. This scumbag was a psychiatrist working out of Louisiana, with his primary study being deep brain stimulation, or DBS. Heath proposed that through DBS he was capable of influencing anyone to be able to change their mind, and thus he could cure mental illness through electrical stimulation. His claims were absurd, stating that he had successfully managed to give patients schizophrenia through blood transfusions and electrical shocks. As most of those patients died, it was fairly difficult to confirm this. He also claimed to find the cure for being gay. He claimed that he'd managed to quote-unquote cure a patient of being gay, since that was actually considered a mental illness at the time. It's also implied that he had an involvement with the project MK-Ultra, though this remains unconfirmed, but extremely plausible. Number 2. Ilya Ivanov. A Russian scientist, if you couldn't tell immediately, Ivanov was a particularly strange scientist. The majority of his experiments revolving around two things. The first was the perfection of the method in which artificial insemination was done, which allowed for easier access to the technology, which was primarily used by horse breeders. His second interest was weirder. Ivanov apparently was extremely interested in creating a human-ape hybrid. Fortunately, he only attempted to do this through artificial insemination. Ivanov failed to create a pregnancy, but his legacy lives on as one of the most odd experiments ever conceived. Like, just why?
Number 10, monkey head transplant. Okay, right off the top, here we go, pun intended. The first ever successful monkey head transplant was back in the early 1970s. I imagine some of your parents may have heard about this. It's probably pretty hard to forget. Maybe ask them about it tonight while they're mid-bite at dinner. American researcher Robert White pulled off the otherwise impossible in a slow, tedious operation. White took the head of one monkey and then attached it to a headless monkey. Yeah, add a little time and energy and voila, this actually worked. Yeah, believe it or not, the monkey actually tried to bite one of the surgeons once it came to, which, I mean, totally fair. I'd be a little pissed off too if I just had a different body all of a sudden. Sadly, the monkey passed away 9 days later, which is much further than I ever thought. But the fact that this actually happened is 1, terrifying, and 2, dare I say, miraculous. This is some sci-fi stuff right here. And here you go, new head, enjoy. Number 9, monkey become human. Okay, this next test here is a little less hands-on, so if you have some food, you could probably take a bite during this one. It's safe. Back in 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg, familiar name, he was curious. Yeah, he sat up one night out of the blue and thought, what would happen if a monkey was raised with humans? Yeah, would it end up like that monkey from MVP, Most Valuable Primate? Would it learn to play hockey for the local team? Or would it learn how to do kickflips with Tony Hawk? No, none of that happened. Surprise, surprise. Kellogg brought a baby female chimp named Gua into his home, and this man raised a chimp as if it were another human being alongside his own son, human son, Donald. Yeah, they played, they laughed, they did everything together. But the test ended abruptly after Kellogg's son, Donald, started to make chimp noises. Yeah, and then everyone was like, you know what? I'm good, let's cancel this. Maybe chimps can't learn how to heel flip. We're done, let's go home. So Gua was then released. There we go. No more human best friend, you know? Back to normal, dare I say, normal? Number 8, feel the music. Okay, this next one here is a little fun, and we're on a part 3, and I have to talk about it. I just have to talk about it. There are many odd experiments in history where humans should have left, you know, human elements out, like music and illicit substances. I can't say what I want to say, but it's white, it's fluffy. It's a bad substance that's white and fluffy. There you go, that's all I'll say. YouTube's like, what is he saying? I can't figure it out. There you go, only you and I know. We're too smart for the algorithm. Well, back in 2011, a study was done where rats, just a bunch of rats, were all put in a room, and on loop, they played a Miles Davis song. So they were all on said illicit substance, right? That stuff, and they were in a room while Miles Davis played all day long. Just smooth jazz all day. I'm not laughing because like it's funny, it's the weirdest thing. Imagine walking into this room by accident, you're like, what's going on in here? Oh my god, everyone's all hopped up. Well, before the substances were injected into the test subjects, they all seemed to have calm demeanors while Beethoven played on loop. But after injected, all the rats were neurologically triggered to that smooth jazz. Yeah, after 1 week on the sauce, the rats were all of a sudden like, you know what? Miles Davis kind of slaps. Been sleeping on Miles Davis this whole time. They're all like, yeah, Miles Davis, really good, so good. Horrible animal research and taxpayers' money. Yeah, we love dark history here on Most Amazing Top 10. Number 7, the first pregnancy test. If you're looking past the ancient Egyptian times and their use of barley and urine to determine if somebody is pregnant, you'll often land on this experiment from the 1930s. Now, it was developed in 1931 by Dr. Maurice Friedman at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Now, what would happen is doctors would inject a rabbit with urine from a woman who was suspected of being pregnant, and the rabbit's ovaries could easily tell if that was the case. Accurate test? Yeah. Historical? Of course, it changed the game. Would it also end up with the rabbits passing away? Sadly, also a third yes. It's sad, but more often than not, when humans are involved with any medical process, the test subject dies. You know, before having its head transferred to another animal or something, you're like, what the f is happening here? Number 6, small brain and big brain. This next one here, I mean, again, we're on a part 3. We're getting into some f***ed up stuff. Here we go. In the early 19th century, humans were figuring out a lot of firsts, you know, especially German researcher Carl August Weinhold. He was on the quest to prove to all that the brain and its nervous system were both attached by wires. Yeah, in order to do so, he took brains and spinal cords of deceased cats, and he filled the cavities inside with zinc and silver batteries. And like we know now, the obvious happened. The bodies began to reanimate as if they were alive again. It's like it's black magic. Or batteries, probably batteries. It's definitely the batteries. This was the first time this type of test was done, and now we use electricity and silver for other ways, of course. But thanks to this curious doctor, the early 19th century saw some early Bill Nye the Gross Science Guy stuff. Again, imagine walking into this room by accident. Like, ho, what's going on in here now? Number 5, the multi-dog. Ah, nice, I love dogs. Let's get a bunch for the price of none. Back in the 50s, when a Soviet scientist, Vladimir Demikov, created a multi-dog, Time magazine had to cover it. Of course, this is a feat in science. As cruel as it sounds, of course, the adult dog had a newborn grafted to its neck. It's impressive, but also you're like, ew, my god, Jesus. So when it grew, it could survive off the blood of the main, bigger dog. The body, for lack of a better term, gross. When observed, the puppy did have its own characteristics, which was the craziest point here. Some say it was playful with its growls, just as the other dog's characteristics would be. It's a sad 1950s Soviet animal experiment, so of course the animal didn't survive for a long time. It just, you know, all of a sudden it was on something's neck and then it was in the next life. That's horrible. Number 4, the great razor auk. Once thriving in colonies off North Atlantic coast, the great auk would grow to 30 inches long and its wings would only be used to swim. They were little cute tiny boys. They were cute but quite defenseless, obviously, since they're not here anymore. Around the 1500s, European fishermen discovered this perfect area for hunting, and it just happened to be where most of these great auks were all living. Yeah, Newfoundland. Go get screeched in and then take out 1,000 auks. There we go. It was packed, so they rapidly declined. And by 1950, the last 2 known specimens were hunted by a single fisherman on LD Island. What a But now, scientists plan on using genetic information extracted from their fossils or preserved organs, people how they have, birds in jars and stuff like that. They plan on editing their DNA into the closest living species, which is now the razor-billed auk. So yeah, the organization Revive and Restore may bring these birds back to life. So cute flappy wings may just return. Remember that game Flappy Wings? Disappeared from the App Store so quick. Disappeared faster than number 3, the dodo bird. Dodo birds were once big and beautiful. These flightless ground nesting birds once filled islands all over the Indian Ocean. They had massive talons, they were gray and blue, they didn't have any natural predator until, we came along. Sorry, we got hungry. Around 1507, the island was discovered by Portuguese sailors, and the rest is history. They were the easiest bird to hunt, hence the phrase, dead as a dodo. That's where it comes from. They weren't just loved by sailors either. No, monkeys, rats, pigs, any animal that made its way to the island easily had their eggs for lunch. And reminder, they were big eggs. So it didn't take a long time for the dodo bird population to be completely wiped out. The last dodo was hunted in 1681. Again, imagine being that guy. What a dick. But could it be? Could we bring the dodo back to life with science? Yes, apparently. This could be a real thing. Scientists found an extremely well-preserved dodo skeleton back in 2007, so we may have a chance at picking some DNA apart. A research facility near Melbourne, Australia is currently trying to use pigeon genes, and we're gonna see them in the sky. I mean, I'm all for the idea of bringing back, animals and stuff. Scientifically, that's a wonderful feat. But do we really think no one's gonna make dodo bird chicken wings? I'm gonna get that on Uber Eats in a year. I can just smell it. Number 2, the gastric brooding frog. Crossbreeding and gastric brooding. Nice, we're getting close to the end, it seems. I'm a big fan of frogs, and the gastric brooding frog is particularly interesting to me and also scientists due to their birthing process. If you're eating something, now would be a good time to hit that thumbs up, maybe take a break, put that food to the side for a bit. See, these frogs back, and when they were alive, they would swallow their eggs and then they would hatch them later out of their mouths. Pretty horrible if you watch that in time lapse, I bet. They're fascinating creatures. And with the Lazarus Project, scientists are actually trying to bring back the Australian gastric brooding frog from extinction. So we might see this horrible act in person. You might go to catch a frog and then all of a sudden it'll be like, wah, and then a baby will come out of it and you'll be like, all right, I'm all set actually, how about that? They went extinct back in 1983, but scientists have figured out how to implant dead cells into a fresh egg from an entirely different frog species. Amphibians are declining worldwide, so if we can get these guys back out of extinction, it'd be 1 point for Gryffindor. We'd be looking a lot better, that's all I'm saying. And finally, number 1, Martha. Look, I like to keep it light, so I have to end with my girl Martha. The passenger pigeon once flocked over the skies of Canada. This was the 19th century, and it looked a lot different. Billions of these bright orange birds would just paint the skies, and rumor has it, they would fly in flocks so large that it would block the sun out for a short amount of time. Wow. Hashtag flocks that block. We love it. But only a few decades passed and the passenger pigeon, they're gone. Just like that. They're no more. So what exactly happened? Well, the very last passenger pigeon, her name was Martha. She sadly passed away in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. So we took a look at her DNA to see if Martha held any secrets to her past and their extinction. And we found a couple. They discovered Martha had a low genetic diversity for such a growing population. Natural selection and hunting eliminated the nicest looking pigeon, arguably. The last one died in 1914, but in 2019, paleontologists found remains of the pigeon in protected indigenous lands in the Northwest Territories. So now they blended passenger pigeon DNA with dinosaur DNA, so that's always exciting. We've seen a few movies on how that can go wrong. We're bringing back pigeons with a touch of dinosaur. I'll say it again, on one hand, I'm glad science is allowing us to, try again, have another go, but look at the pigeons we have now. Those pigeons are hardcore. These things will walk onto the subway with you. Pigeons today will ask you for change. They're ruthless. They're covered in mustard. It's not the same. These graceful birds from the 1910s, I feel like we're bringing back Captain America. You know what I mean? I don't think these old school chaps will appreciate the new game of pigeons. They're a little dirty. I don't know. I don't think they're ready, and I don't think we are either.
Number 10, the Stanford prison experiment. We're starting with one of the more arguably famous examples on the list, though the references to it as a successful experiment might be pushing it. In the summer of 1971, a professor of psychology by the name of Philip Zimbardo would lead a study at Stanford University. The idea was to create a prison environment in which participants would be placed in different roles as either prisoners or guards. Paid $15 an hour, which is roughly equivalent to 110 United States dollars today, participants were set to live within this brutal environment for a period of 2 weeks. But the experiment ended up only lasting 5. You'll see why soon. The idea was that the experiment would allow professors to study the difference in the balance of power within prisons, as well as learn about antisocial behavior, a note which even led the US Navy to fund the experiment. Over the course of 5 days, prisoners were tortured by the guards, each guard becoming drastically more cruel and vile to their charges. They were psychologically manipulated and abused, given arbitrary tasks and regulations which included management of when they could use the bathroom and where. Humiliation was regular, and by the third day, several prisoners underwent a few breakdowns and were released. On the fifth day of the experiment, Professor Christina Maslach would visit the experiment and immediately demand it cease. The next day, Zimbardo did halt the experiment and offered to pay all participants their full wages. It would later be revealed that the guards only acted in the ways they did under Zimbardo's instruction, which led to the impossibility of the experiment's reproduction and an immediate nationwide review of the ethics in experimentation. Number 9. The Neubauer separations. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who immigrated to the US in 1941 from Austria. Initially taking work for the Bellevue Hospital in New York, Neubauer began to work on one of the most vile experiments in his entire career. Attempting to study the differences in twins and triplets, Neubauer oversaw the separation of multiple groups of twins and one set of triplets, overseeing their growth and development into adults. Neubauer never revealed to the twins nor their adoptive parents that they had siblings, and when the twins did learn of this, there was outrage. Numerous biographical stories have been published on this. Several twins also unfortunately took their own lives, and the findings of the study have been sealed by Neubauer within Yale University until 2065. Number 8. Project 4.1. In March 1st, 1954, the Marshall Island region known as Bikini Atoll was subjected to nuclear weapons tests led by the United States government and dubbed Castle Bravo. As a result, fallout was carried eastwards, contaminating 23 members of a Japanese fishing vessel and the entire populations of the Rongelap and Utrecht atolls. Instead of taking responsibility, the government organized Project 4.1 with the intent of studying the Marshallese victims. Ultimately, 239 Marshallese people were exposed, as well as 28 Americans who were stationed on one of the atolls. Effects included loss of hair, skin damage, lesions, and extreme development of cancer, as well as miscarriages and stillbirths. The US government has never attempted to give compensation for these actions. Number 7. Burke and Hare. 19th and 20th century medical history has had a long and troubled history. As scientists have attempted to better understand the human body, a number of them have taken extreme measures to obtain subjects. One of the more notorious of these involved William Burke and William Hare, two men working out of Edinburgh, Scotland. During a decline in legally supplied cadavers, Hare was lodging a friend who suddenly passed away. Turning to his friend Burke, the two decided to sell the corpse to Robert Knox. As more people lodged at the Hare's house, the two men took the life of a sick woman and sold the body to Knox. They continued their spree until the discovery of Margaret Docherty, their final victim. The two were found guilty and executed, and Knox was exonerated of charges, though whether or not he actually knew how the bodies were retrieved remains an open question. Number 6. Project MK Ultra. Another infamous experiment, MK Ultra began with the intention of developing new drugs for the CIA to use in interrogations. The method in which these experiments were carried out was disgusting, with over 7,000 non-consenting civilians from the US and Canada unknowingly made to participate. Psychoactive drugs were secretly administered to them, as well as the use of electroshock therapy, hypnosis, isolation, and a lot of other forms of abuse and torture that are not great. Anyways, running from 1950 to 1970, it wouldn't be until 1975 when these experiments were brought to light by Frank Church. But as the documents were destroyed by a knee-jerk response to the Watergate scandal in 1973, most of the evidence is largely testimonial. However, in 2001, a large number of documents were discovered and declassified. Number 5. The Monster Study. Another disgusting experiment. The Monster Study was headed by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist working out of the University of Iowa. Johnson's experiment was performed on 22 orphans with the goal of inducing stuttering within the subjects. Effectively, half of the orphans were given positive encouragement during their speech therapy, while the other half were mocked for their speech even if they didn't stutter to begin with. The staff would lie and pretend that the orphans were showing signs of potentially stuttering. The results? Well, it didn't induce stuttering as Johnson had hoped, and most of the subjects became withdrawn and extremely defensive. Who'da thunk it? Number 4. The Aversion Project. A program developed by Dr. Aubrey Levin in South Africa. The intent of this experiment was to attempt to cure soldiers of their homosexuality. I want to let that one sit for a little bit, let it simmer in your brain. As being gay was banned in the South African military, Levin was free to do as he pleased to his victims, which included chemical castration and compulsion electroshock therapy. There were a grand total of 900 victims of these experiments. Levin got 5 years in prison. I really don't want to talk about this anymore. Number 3. The Tuskegee Study. Conducted between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study was a racially motivated experiment which used black people exclusively as subjects. Attempting to study syphilis and its effects, a total of 600 men were studied, with 399 being infected with the disease. These men were informed that the experiment would only take 6 months, treated with a number of toxic solutions including arsenic and mercury, and then were administered placebos. It was then extended to 40 years, with the victims never knowing that the disease was one they could spread. Not to mention that they never even knew why the experiment was being done in the first place. These men continued to be subjected to even more drugs and spinal taps, but hey, in 1947 they figured out that penicillin was actually a pretty solid drug that worked on syphilis. So anyways, they just kind of kept going until Peter Buxton blew the whistle on the operation. In the end, most of the subjects died as a result of the experiment, and several legal cases led to a number of settlements from the government, the most famous being Pollard versus the United States. Number 2. The Guatemala Syphilis Study. So nice, they did it twice. Wow, it's almost like there's a trend here or something. Perpetrated by John Charles Cutler, also worked on the Tuskegee study. This study was initially meant to be inflicted on an Indiana-based prison, but instead moved to Guatemala. Why? Well, it isn't officially stated, but I think we can all probably guess. Subjects were exposed to syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroids, with over 5,000 people having participated and 83 passing away during the experiment. And of course, the US government has never compensated its victims. Number 1. Unit 731. The horrors inflicted by the Imperial Japanese Army were many, but none so great as the ones inflicted by Unit 731. When the complex was built in Pingfang, the initial intent was to build biological weapons, and their test subjects were Chinese civilians, trained to view their victims as non-human and told to refer to them as logs. The experiments that were carried out by 731 led to the deaths of between 200 and 300,000 individuals. Some of the experiments included vivisection, poisoning, weapons testing, frostbite testing, syphilis testing, and also some of the literal worst things I have ever had to read about. The Japanese government has not taken responsibility for this alongside their other numerous war crimes committed during the Second World War, and when victims have asked for compensation, they have been refused on the grounds that their needs were met by international peace treaties.
In our number 10 spot, we have the hepatitis outbreak. Allegedly, in the 50s, there was a New York state-run institution for mentally handicapped young ones called Willowbrook State School, and it unfortunately was known for its uncleanliness, and as a result, the school had an outbreak of hepatitis. A doctor got wind of what was going on in that school, and he created an experiment that would assist in developing a vaccine. The only problem is the experiment would involve deliberately infecting the young ones with the disease. Horrible. His name was Dr. Sewell Krugman. The experiment received a lot of attention from the media, but the parents signed permission slips, so people let it go, unfortunately. However, apparently it was very hard to get into this school, so some think that parents felt that they had to sign these forms and allow it in order to keep their kid there. I can imagine that in the 50s there wasn't a lot of options, so that's truly sad, especially hearing that their only option was an extremely dirty school. In our number 9 spot, we have nuclear testing. In 1954, the US government started performing nuclear tests near the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. The US was performing a series of nuclear tests that they called Castle Bravo, and these tests unfortunately resulted in a yield larger than anticipated. This then led the government to create Project 4.1, where they decided to study how the humans, the Marshallese nearby, were affected by the explosion. Some believe that the explosion and its impact was all an accident, but Some believe that the US government planned this so that they could study and see how these people would be affected. Many of the Marshallese people had radiation poisoning, and of course, as you can imagine, many developed cancer that is believed to be associated with the explosion. Beta burns were also seen after the incident. In our number 8 spot, we have electroshock therapy. Some of these experiments quite possibly could have been done by people that believe that they are doing some good, but they themselves are insane. Either that or they are evil, because to experiment on young ones in any way is truly sickening. Here we have a doctor in the 1960s named Dr. Loretta Bender, who worked at New York's Creedmoor Hospital, and she began a treatment that she believed to be a revolutionary treatment for kids with social issues. It was electroshock therapy. She would interview and analyze a young one in front of a large group of people, and she would apply pressure to their heads. Apparently, the people who would move were considered to have shown early signs of schizophrenia. It was said that she was not sympathetic to the young patients, and that in her time she used this electroshock therapy on over 100 young ones. It is unknown how these young ones were affected long term. In our number 7 spot, we have the stuttering experiment. Here we have yet another experiment that makes my blood boil. I'll get to why in a bit. This test took place in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor, and the purpose of this test was to analyze the psychology around why people stutter and or how it can be cured. These researchers experimented on 22 young orphans and separated them into 2 groups. One group got praise for how they spoke, and the other group got negative feedback. The group that got negative feedback had normal speaking orphans suddenly begin to develop speech problems that apparently they had for the rest of their lives. I myself have struggled with speaking in my past, and that is why I actually started pushing myself to be in front of the camera and practice. So it's definitely hard to hear about experiments like this that could truly make or break the confidence of a young person. So gross. In our number 6 spot, we have the prison transplants. From 1913 to 1951, there was a surgeon doctor at California's San Quentin prison by the name of Dr. Leo Stanley, who obviously had access to many patients in the prison, and so he began to start testing on them. The experiments would range from sterilization to potential treatments for the Spanish flu to performing transplant surgeries. The transplant surgeries would actually be testicle transplants using testicles of executed prisoners, and sometimes from animals like goats, for example. Yeah, that is truly horrific and definitely evil, and arguably he should have been in this prison. Isn't it weird how many horrible prison guard or prison doctor stories there are out there about them mistreating the inmates? Something that I'm sure a lot of prisoners were imprisoned for. Makes you think. In our number 5 spot, we have the Guatemalan test subjects. From 1946 to 1948, the US government, the president of Guatemala, and the health ministry in Guatemala were all in cahoots with each other, and they began performing experiments on Guatemalans without their consent. They were made to participate. Doctors deliberately infected people with syphilis and sexually transmitted diseases to track their untreated natural progression. Holy moly. When you think about it, that was after the war and only 76 years ago. It would be naive to think that this would never happen again. These patients were only given antibiotics to help. This resulted in 30 deaths, however, that is only what was documented. We don't actually know how many deaths actually occurred from this. It was only in 2010 that the US government made a formal apology for their involvement. In our number 4 spot, we have the Tuskegee experiment. This one is another experiment that is just simply so gross that it's hard to even talk about. In 1932, the US Public Health worked with the Tuskegee Institute to track the natural progression of untreated syphilis. 600 people from Alabama were experimented on and infected with syphilis, and of the group, 399 already had syphilis. None of them were told that they had a disease that was life-threatening. They were told that they would receive free health care for participating, free meals, and burial insurance. The study continued till 1972, long after a cure was found. Many passed away and got severely ill from this experiment. In 1997, the president at the time, Bill Clinton, apologized to those affected, and he called this the most infamous biomedical experiment in US history. That was said in 1997 though, so I'm sure there have been more famous worldwide biomedical experiments now that perhaps we, the public, are just not aware of yet. If it took 25 years to get a formal apology and for it to become public knowledge, then who knows what we might discover and get an apology for in the future. In our number 3 spot, we have the mosquito experiment. How more people don't know about these experiments is truly beyond me. This one is deeply shocking to hear, so brace yourself. In 1956 and 1957, the US Army, aka the government because it would have had to have been approved, conducted a series of experiments on Florida, Georgia, and Savannah where they released millions of infected mosquitoes in order to see if insects could spread yellow fever. Of course, they learned that yes, they can, as many people contracted fevers, serious respiratory problems, stillbirths, typhoid, and much more. Apparently, to take it another step further, in order to get photo evidence of the experiment, researchers acted as health workers so they could see the patients. Many died from this experiment, as you can imagine. I wonder if there are any long-term effects for the people in these areas. I guess that's info I'm sure we'll never know. It's probably kept in top secret places like Area 51, let's be real. In our number 2 spot, we have Korean experimentation. Allegedly, there have been a ton of North Korean experiments over the years on prisoners. One experiment that has been spoken about was one where 50 female prisoners, all of good health, were given poisoned cabbage leaves. Apparently, within the hour, all had died. Allegedly, they also do experimental surgeries without anesthesia, starve them, and at times gas entire families. It is rumored that there is a van called the Crow where people are taken every month for these experiments. I truly hope that this is something from the past, but I know that there will always be evil in the world as much as we all wish there wasn't, so I wouldn't be surprised to hear that this is possibly something that still happens, and I truly hope it isn't. In our number 1 spot, we have Navy volunteers. In 1943, young men who were in the Navy were basically tricked into volunteering themselves to be gassed. This happened in the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington in the US. They were told that this experiment might help shorten the war, and so of course they wanted to do their duty and help. They were exposed to mustard gas, which of course was a deadly gas that was actively used in World War I. They were only told what they were participating in once the experiment was about to start. All of the soldiers suffered severe external and internal burns. All of the people were allegedly silenced and threatened by the Navy, and it wasn't until the 90s, when the documents were declassified, was this experiment taken to Congress.
Coming in at number 10 is Parallel Universe. A group of NASA scientists working on an experiment in Antarctica have detected evidence of a parallel universe where the rules of physics are opposite of our own, according to a report. A cosmic ray detection experiment has found particles that could be from a parallel realm that was also born in the Big Bang. Now, the expert used a giant balloon to carry NASA's Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna, or ANITA, high above Antarctica, where the frigid dry air provided the perfect environment with little to no radio noise to distort its findings. Now, a constant wind of high energy particles constantly arrives on Earth from outer space. That means the high energy particles can only be detected coming down from space, but the team's ANITA detected heavier particles, so-called tow neutrinos, which come up out of the Earth. Now, the finding implies that these particles are actually traveling backward in time, suggesting evidence of a parallel universe. The simplest explanation for the phenomenon is that at the moment of the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, 2 universes were formed, ours and the one that from our perspective is running in reverse with time going backwards. We're left with the most exciting or most boring possibilities, said Ibrahim Safa, who worked on the experiment. Number 9. Million-year-old DNA. In the fall 2022, scientists announced that they uncovered million-year-old DNA just north of the continent of Antarctica. Yeah, 1 million years old. Now, scientists actually accidentally collected the unusual genetic samples up to 584 feet beneath the seafloor as part of a 2019 survey led by the International Ocean Discovery Program in the Scotia Sea north of mainland Antarctica. The ancient sediment that was discovered is now the oldest marine DNA DNA found from seafloor sediments. The team looked closely at damage patterns within the recovered DNA fragments to establish exactly how old they were. Now, the oldest fragments clocked in at around 1 million years old. Now, until now, the oldest SIDA DNA, which was found locked inside Arctic permafrost, dated to around 650,000 years ago. Now, this DNA will be analyzed and studied by scientists, as it will tell us a lot about the polar marine ecosystem, as well as how climate change may affect Antarctica. Number 8. Earthquake swarms. A series of earthquakes was recently discovered all the way in Antarctica, the southernmost continent. Now, scientists discovered earthquake swarms occurred along the Shetland Plate and the Antarctic Plate. Now, the swarms lasted from August 2020 all the way through February 2021. Within that time, around 85,000 earthquakes occurred, which is insane and low-key scary. Scientists believe this series of earthquake storms were caused by the eruption of a dormant volcano. Now, the swarm occurred around the Orca Seamount, an inactive volcano that rises 2,950 feet from the seafloor in the Bransfield Strait. Now, the two largest earthquakes in the series were a magnitude of 5.9 quake in October 2020 and a magnitude 6.0 quake in November. Number 7. Colossal Squid Expedition. An international expedition of scientists conducted a colossal squid exploration in December 2022 and were able to grab videos and photos of some of the rare species swimming far beneath the surface. Now, this type of squid is the largest invertebrate in the world, and this expedition could reveal important information about the behaviors and habits of the colossal squids, as well as information on animal life in Antarctica in general. Now, this species was first discovered in 1925, so the goal of the scientists was to capture footage of this majestic creature before the 100-year anniversary of its discovery. Now, while this discovery in Antarctica is still underway, there is much more we can learn about these creatures. Number 6. Meteorite. In January this year, on an excursion to the icy plains of Antarctica, an international team of researchers discovered 5 new meteorites, including one of the largest ever found on the continent. Now, the rare meteorite is about the size of a cantaloupe, but weighs a hefty 17 pounds. The specimen is one of only about 100 that size or larger discovered in Antarctica, a prime meteorite hunting location where more than 45,000 space rocks have been tracked down. Now, the exceptional find is heading to the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels, where it can be studied. Maria Valdez, a research scientist at Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History and the University of Chicago, who is part of the expedition team, has kept some of the material for her own analysis. She'll take her samples and use strong acids to dissolve them before a process called calibrated chemistry to isolate various elements that make up the rock. Then I can start to think about the origin of this rock, how it evolved over time, what kind of parent body it came from, and where in the solar system the parent body formed, she said. These are the kind of big questions that we try to address. Number 5. Strange creatures. In 2021, geologist James Smith of the British Antarctic Survey drilled through an Antarctic ice shelf to sample sediment which was locked under half a mile of ice. To get to it, James and his colleagues had to melt 20 tons of snow to create 20,000 liters of hot water, which they then pumped through a pipe lowered down a borehole. Next, they lowered an instrument to collect the sediment along with a GoPro camera. Later that night in his tent, James watched the footage and he found a rock 4,600 feet under the surface. Now, it was the wrong place for collecting seafloor muck, but the absolute right place for a 1 in a million shot of finding life in an environment that scientists didn't think could support that much of it. A layer of bacteria known as microbial mat was on the rock. An alien-like sponge and other stalked animals dangled from the rock, while stoder cylindrical sponges hugged at the surface. The rock was also lined with wispy filaments, perhaps a component of the bacterial mats, or perhaps a particular animal known as a hydroid. Now, whatever the case, this was an extraordinary find that they will be continuing to study. Number 4. Deepest Point Mapped. A new map of the Southern Ocean gave scientists their most detailed view to date of the seafloor surrounding Antarctica, including its deepest point, the Factorian Deep. Resting at a depth of around 24,400 feet below sea surface, or 17 Empire State Buildings stacked top to bottom, the Factorian Deep was only discovered in 2019. But until now, researchers had no idea how it fit together with the surrounding seafloor. The new map draws from more than 1,200 sonar data sets collected mostly by science vessels and covers more than 18.5 million square miles of the seafloor. Researchers hope to use the sea bottom chart to identify underwater mountains or seamounts that might be hotspots for marine life. Number 3. Blood Falls. In the McMurdo Dry Valley, a bright crimson 5-story waterfall pours out of Taylor Glacier into Lake Bonny. It looks like a gush of blood from a wound in the ice, but scientists have recently discovered the cause behind this mysterious phenomenon. The water that feeds Blood Falls was once a salty lake that is now cut off from the atmosphere due to the formation of glaciers on top of the lake. Now the water is preserved 400 meters underground and has become even saltier over time. It's now 3 times saltier than seawater and cannot freeze. The salt water is also extremely rich in iron and completely devoid of oxygen and sunlight. As the iron-rich water seeps through a fissure in the glacier and comes to contact with the air, the iron oxidizes and rusts, staining the water a dark red color. Now just looking at this freaks me out, but I'm glad scientists were able to discover the reason behind it. Number 2. Singing ice. It appears that a massive slab of ice in Antarctica is singing. The Ross Ice Shelf is the largest ice shelf in Antarctica. It's several hundred meters thick and covers an area of over 500,000 square kilometers, around the size of France. Scientists have recently discovered that the Ross Ice Shelf sings an eerie melody caused by the winds blowing across the snow dunes. The winds create surface vibrations and almost non-stop seismic tones. Now the vibrations aren't audible to human ears, and scientists use seismic sensors to hear the tune. Now the song was actually discovered by accident after seismic sensors were installed on the ice shelf to observe other behaviors. Now scientists have since discovered that the song changes in response to the environment, such as melting or storms shifting the snow. They're now using the song as a tool to monitor the ice shelf in real time, tracking its stability and vulnerability for collapse through the seismic humming. And coming in number 1 is secret lakes. It's difficult to imagine anything beneath the thick layers of ice in Antarctica, yet scientists have discovered a number of underground lakes. First uncovered in 1970 with radars, there are estimated to be around 400 lakes sitting under 3 kilometers of ice. Scientists believe the lakes were formed after the separation of Antarctica from Gondwanaland, the ancient supercontinent. Lake Vostok, discovered in the 1990s by Russian scientists, is the largest subglacial lake in Antarctica. In 2014, scientists had a major breakthrough at Lake Wallens, discovering a diverse and active ecosystem of microorganisms in the lake, nearly a kilometer under an ice sheet. Then in 2022, researchers discovered a city-sized lake hidden deep underneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. The hidden lake, which was named Lake Snow Eagle, has a surface area of 143 square miles and lies in a mile-deep canyon beneath 2 miles of ice. The team uncovered the lake following 3 years of exhaustive aerial surveys over the ice sheet, using radar and special sensors designed to measure minuscule changes in Earth's gravity. Now experts believe it can contain 34-million-year-old river sediments that are older than the ice sheet itself, and could shed light on what Antarctica was like before the continent froze.